This is Teaching for Student Success. I'm Stephen Robineau. Transcriptions are here. Teaching for Student Success is excited to partner with Trint. Learn more at Trint, TRINT.com, transcribing audio and video to text. Grades, grading, and alternatives to the traditional grading system have been the most common and most listened to topics on this podcast. Grades are problematic for so many reasons. Here are just two. They demotivate students. And two, we, the faculty, professional schools, graduate programs, we think these grades mean something. And they do mean something. However, what they mean rarely reflects what students have learned. So we know this. There's tens of thousands of people around the country talking about this. But there's 1.5 million faculty around the country. So even if there's 10,000 faculty, even if there's 100,000 faculty talking about this around the country, that means over 90% of the faculty are not. And it's time, whatever those numbers are, it's time to make them bigger. In this episode, we will have a conversation with Dr. Jesse Stommel about the problems with and possible solutions for the traditional grading system in which most of us participate. Dr. Jesse Stommel is a faculty member in the writing program at the University of Denver. He is co-founder of Hybrid Pedagogy, the Journal of Critical Digital Pedagogy. Jesse's a prolific writer. His publications concerning pedagogy alone would be enough to fill any CV. But he also publishes extensively within his discipline, which seems to be inhabited by zombies. Here's one title just to give you a taste. This is a contribution in a book. The book is called The Written Dead, The Zombie as a Literary Phenomenon. And his contribution is titled Desiring Machines, or Desiring Machines, Zombies, Automata, and Cormac McCarthy's The Road. And maybe we can clarify which is the right interpretation of desiring machines. Anyway, whether or not we talk about zombies today, I'm very excited to welcome Dr. Jesse Stommel. Jesse, thank you for joining us on Teaching for Student Success.
Thank you so much for having me. Yep, looking forward to the full range of this potential conversation. Ultimately, I think for me, all of those things sit next to one another, but it's not always clear what they're doing next to one another.
The zombies and assessment?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, that's interesting. Now, is it desiring machines or desiring machines? How do you...
I think it's either. I mean, ultimately, it's both of those things simultaneously.
Okay.
Machines that experience desire, but also our desire for machines. And ultimately, it's that conundrum that piece is trying to explore.
Cool. So the ambiguity is intentional, of course. That's fantastic. Thank you. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. Let's start with a term that I haven't mentioned yet, I don't think, which is ungrading. You helped define and frame this term. Let's spend a few minutes talking about the origin of the term.
Yeah, I mean, I can think of a couple of ways that I would talk about it. One, I would think about what's underlying the term. What is the conversation underlying the term, and what is the origin of that conversation? And ultimately, for me, grades are a technology with a relatively recent history. We think of grades as something that is tacit accepted, status quo. Often I ask, why do we grade? And people say, because we always have. But the truth is we haven't always graded. They have about a 200-year history, but honestly, they've only been popularized in the last 60 years, 60 to 70. And ultimately, ungrading is also not a new phenomenon. As long as there have been grades, there has been significant pushback on grades. So you can look at the work of John Dewey, for example, and he's thinking and pushing back on grades. You can even look at the work of Henry David Thoreau or Ralph Waldo Emerson, and even in the work of Virginia Woolf, there is kind of a pushback against the quantification of learning and the reducing of learning to a series of marks. And so I think that ungrading has that long of a history. As long as there have been grades, there has been ungrading, a conversation pushing back on grades. I would say that my thinking about the term has about I've been teaching for 24 years now, and I've been doing faculty development work for about 21 years. And one of the first workshops that I led was on ungrading and assessment. At that point in that workshop, I didn't call it ungrading, although I very quickly started to refer to it casually as ungrading. in those kinds of workshops. So for me, this has about a 20-year history. I only started writing about it and really putting that word more explicitly to the concept that I was trying to explore about 5 or 6 years ago. 2017, I've started publishing a series of blog posts that were really taking the content of those workshops I had been leading for the last 20 years and starting to figure out what the philosophy that underpinned those workshops was.
Thank you. When you mention the term ungrading, you talk about it as unsettling in one of your recent articles. Do you want to talk about why you find that term unsettling?
When I first wrote the piece in 2017, the one that kicked off the series of blog posts, my close colleague, Sean Michael Morris, read the piece before I published it on my blog. And when he got to the part at the end where I talked about and framed the conversation using the word ungrading, he immediately bristled and told me that I should take that part out. And he told me I should take the part out because what he worried about was that that word by itself would turn the concept into a zeitgeist, that it ran the risk of becoming sort of ungrading TM, trademark ungrading, and that it would be a kind of thing that would run away out of my reach.
Mm-hmm.
And it was interesting at the moment that I did that and that he made that suggestion, I sort of agreed with him. And I just made an agreement with myself. And the agreement I made with myself was that if I was going to keep that word in and keep that concept that I was framing in the end of that piece, that I would just be there at every step of the way. If what I did caused that to kind of run off and become its own thing that kind of was separate from what I was talking about, I would just be there to say, let's take a step back and let's talk about this. And what is it we're really doing here? And ultimately try the best I could to not let it be a zeitgeist.
Okay.
And so if I said now what I think that is the problem with the concept of ungrading, it is that it has the ability to do exactly that, to become something that is easy, something that offers a set of best practices that someone can kind of grab and go from a sort of pedagogical cafeteria and do tomorrow and snap their fingers and suddenly they've transformed their classroom. And I think that that's seriously problematic. Ultimately, any kind of instrumentalizing of the work of teaching, reducing teaching to a set of static practices is problematic. But I think it's especially problematic with something like this. There's so much that we have to unpack, so many issues, so many problems that grades have. Ultimately, just changing the way that we talk about assessment means that we have to ask much deeper questions about the purpose of education more broadly. And so that's the danger that I think that the term has, and that I've seen examples of it being reduced in that way.
That's interesting. Right. So you've raised this issue of ungrading as a process, and you're concerned that it just becomes, okay, here's how you ungrade, here's what you do, here's this checklist, do it, and everything's going to be perfect, which is not true. And then there's this notion of ungrading as a concept around which we need to discuss assessment. And it sounds like I believe what you just said is you're trying to rein that conversation back to keep it from running away down that path of here are the rules of engagement, of ungrading, and to keep it on a discussion, on this other discussion. Is that right?
In that first blog post that I wrote, there's a quote by Alfie Kohn that I end that piece with. And he writes that when the hows of assessment preoccupy us, they tend to chase the whys back into the shadows. That ultimately, for me, the work of ungrading is not a set of practices. It is instead a series of conversations that get at the heart of what we're doing and why we're doing it, as opposed to 10 things you can do tomorrow in order to revolutionize or transform your teaching.
Right. So let's focus on the whys then. Yeah, let's focus on the whys, the more interesting question. There have to be questions about how, if you're going to do it. You have to come down to that, but that's going to look different for every situation, I suspect. But let me ask more generally, do you envision short-term, near-term? I'm a near-term person, but lots of people are very long-term. It depends on what game you play. Do you envision post-secondary institutions, I want to keep it broad, abandoning summative assessments of students? Is that something that in the long term we can give up, or is there a need to be able to, in ways, summatively assess students over time?
To me, this isn't an issue of whether all assessment should be formative or a summative assessment. Ultimately, it's a question of what kind of assessments are we using?
Mm-hmm.
What kind of a summative assessment would I object to or would I find problematic? Ultimately, it's when that summative assessment becomes quantified and standardized. When we try and imagine that students can be neat and tidily ranked against one another. And truthfully, that's equally bad whether we're doing that formatively during the learning process or at the end of the learning. So to me, the thing that's more problematic than the summative part is the standardized and quantified, reducing students to a set of numbers, reducing their work to columns in a spreadsheet.
Right. So you mentioned the competitive aspect of grades. Now, grades don't have to be competitive. That's how they have been traditionally implemented. This notion of the bell curve. I just had actually yesterday. I just put up a podcast with David Clark and Robert Talbert, and we talked about that issue a little bit. Right. Just this. But once if you're willing to abandon the normal curve, the bell curve, and realize that grades don't have to be used that way, we can still grade and get rid of the competition, can't we?
I mean, the thing is, you have to change a whole lot about the system.
Yeah.
For example, when you quantify things and you reduce summative assessment to I get a 96, you get a 94, those numbers fail to communicate anything meaningful except that the 96 is better than the 94. We could sit down and just talk, well, what does the 96 mean when it's sitting next to the other person who got the 94? And I don't think we could come up with any shared agreement as to what those numbers would mean. So sure, to some extent, I think we could grade non-competitively, but our grading system is so dependent upon a couple things, dependent upon the ability or the sort of false notion that we could quantify learning, whether it's in a letter or a number or a percentile, et cetera.
Right.
And also, I think, in the false assumption that what we should be doing when we're assessing summatively is ranking students against one another, comparing them to one another, as opposed to allowing each student to be their own unique person. And then at the second that they're unique people not being ranked against one another, then our goal is what communicates the best. And a 94, 96, 93, A minus / B plus, those things are so arbitrary that they don't communicate much at all.
Right. So what do you envision as a system that allows students to progress through an institution, move on to jobs, to further education? Do we need assessments? What do we need? What's needed, I guess?
I think we need assessment. I don't think we need grades as a form of assessment.
Okay.
I think we need assessment. And it's not even that we need assessment. It's that assessment is ultimately inevitable. Assessment happens. Mm-hmm. Whether we pedagogically design for assessment and design for good assessment and meaningful assessment, that's another question. But when my daughter learned how to walk, every foot that she put on the ground was an act of assessment. Mm-hmm. Is this foot going to hold me when I put my weight on it?
Right.
Is there a rock under my foot? What happens when I put this much weight on? So there's constant feedback that the world is giving us. Right. So assessment's all over the place. And we're assessing when we learn language. We're assessing when we learn to walk. We're assessing the trust that we could build in a room based on where people are sitting and where the professor is standing and how they're speaking to us and where they're directing their attention. All of that stuff is a kind of assessment. The real question is, are we being pedagogically thoughtful in how we use assessment in our learning environment?
Okay, so then we need assessment in two ways, at least two ways. I mean, students need to be able to assess themselves to know where they are along the way of developing expertise. They need to know how they're doing. Am I tripping and falling down? Your daughter is how old now? We have to talk about your daughter for a second. How old is she now?
She's 6 years old.
6. Okay, that's fantastic. Congratulations. So she's well past the walking stage. Yeah. She's got that down now.
Yeah. And now she's being graded and I'm getting report cards.
Yes. She's getting okay. So students need assessment. Let me rephrase that. Learners need assessment to know how you're doing. And the learners that we have in our classes, they're novices in the fields in which we are experts. So we're the experts. We're there to guide them and help them learn. Whether they know how to learn, that's another question. We can go back and listen to a podcast with other people about how to learn. But all along the way, students need to be able to know how they're doing. They need to have metacognitive moments when they can say, how am I doing? Am I learning? So they need assessment to be able to gauge their progress. We currently need assessment because admin, and I'm not degrading admin because I was one, right? We have to have them. We have to give grades currently. But the reason we need grades is questionable. Even the way I started, I mean, graduate schools, they don't need grades. There's a GRE. Currently, there's a test. Go take a test. The grades themselves aren't important. I was talking to one of my podcast guests. Everybody gets A's. So what do grades do? Nothing. They don't tell you anything. Medical schools, you take a test. Law school, you take a test. You go get a job, you have interviews. They could give you a test. Whatever, right? So it's not clear to me that we really need grades at all, other than assessments for students to learn along their way. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I'm thinking about one of the questions that I often ask, and this is one of those foundational questions that we skip past when we skip to the how.
Right.
Is who are grades for?
Yeah.
And so if we're thinking about and examining and wondering at how we should do the work of grading, I mean, we can say across the board, most institutions where people are working require grades in some way or form and have different kinds of restrictions on how you can do your grading. So it's not like we're talking about can individual teachers just throw them out. Right. I do think we can work towards a system where we slowly start to eradicate them and start to change the structures that are living underneath them and make them go. But a question we can ask when we're beginning to think, well, how am I going to do this thing of grading in my classes? Who are grades for? And this can be an existential question, but it can also be a real practical one. Who are they for? Well, they're for the student. Who else are they for? Well, they're for accreditors. They're also for administrators. They're also the Bio 101 teacher is grading in some ways for the Bio 102 teacher to give information, to convey information. We're also grading for future employers. The student's parents might be one of the audience for grades, especially depending on what age the student is. Mm-hmm. So grades are for a lot of different people. I think one of the problems is that we seem unwilling to make the decision about who they are mostly for. And if we decide from the start that they're mostly for students, that the primary goal of assessment of grades is to communicate something to students, to help improve their learning, then we have to be willing to let all of those other audiences suffer to some degree, because we have to be willing to decide if this is my primary audience, if this is who grades are mostly for, then I'm going to design for that audience. And realize there are other potential audiences too. And it's not that I'm going to just say none of them matter. But I think that our systems seem unwilling to just acknowledge that we are not going to grade in a way for the sake of accreditors that does harm to students. If we all agree that we don't want to do harm to students, I think our grading systems would fundamentally change.
So there are already some number of institutions, I don't know the number, that don't grade currently. Evergreen State provide written assessments. People have mentioned other schools. I don't remember. I haven't looked them up. You probably know them all. Apparently, there are institutions where you don't have to grade. You can provide written assessments of students' progress that I can only imagine is most useful to the students. So those institutions exist and they work, and students succeed just fine in these institutions. So why isn't there more pressure just to move down that road?
Yeah, I think this goes back to our discussion earlier, that this is also one of the reasons why the zeitgeist of ungrading is both problematic, but also in some ways erroneous, because a lot of schools have experimented with alternative approaches to assessment that removed grades. There have been a lot of thinkers who have written about removing grades from their classroom for many years. This is not a new conversation. Ultimately, there has been a lot of different schools experimenting with this. And I think too rarely do we really look to those schools as leaders and as models for the ways that we can change our approach. I think that the biggest barrier to doing this work is structural problems at our educational institutions. And if I pointed to what are those, I mean, I think if we look at higher education, for example, in the United States, 70% of faculty members are working adjunct or in contingent positions. And so that labor crisis alone is enough to make it near impossible for pedagogical transformation to happen at our institutions. We just don't have the people that we need in safe, non-precarious positions in order to advocate for students or change that would benefit students.
Interesting. So it's the lack of tenure track faculty that is an impediment to moving this forward. That's interesting because of the risk that they're at to lose their jobs if they argue for changing the grading mechanisms.
And I would say the other structural barrier, the other most significant structural barrier, is that less than half of higher education faculty get any significant preparation in pedagogy at all. And so therefore, that they accept the status quo as good or necessary or inevitable, because they aren't given the tools that they need in order to question or make decisions about their pedagogical approaches.
Right.
They would have no way of knowing the harm that grades do because they have close to zero training in thinking about how assessment works or what assessment even is.
So that's a frightening number. 50%, you said?
It's a rough number. Honestly, there isn't nearly enough research on this.
Yeah, interesting.
But when I've done research, and every bit of research I've seen, none of it is significant to the degree that we need this research to be. And that's partly because there just isn't enough research in this area.
Okay, so research in the area is one issue, but the other is just training faculty in modern pedagogy and the issues around modern pedagogy. And what you're saying is that half the faculty, 750,000 faculty around the country, don't know anything about these issues. They may not know, they may just not be aware. I mean, they're busy. Everybody's busy. It's not saying it's not their fault. Everybody's busy.
Well, and it also isn't their fault because it's a structural problem. It's a structural flaw. It isn't a personal flaw or a moral failing.
Right.
It's a flaw of the system to not weave in that kind of preparation. How many graduate programs have required courses in pedagogy? How many new faculty get something more than a week-long pre-sem preparation course? How many get a full, we have a thing called a freshman experience for undergraduates. Why is there no freshman experience for new faculty at every single institution where faculty spend an entire year talking about their pedagogy and essentially getting the training that they didn't get in graduate school?
Interesting. Okay, so now I'm just getting depressed. So one thing that needs to happen is we just need more training of faculty, adjuncts and not adjuncts. Everybody needs access to some professional development in their career so they can at least so they can learn about some of these issues.
Or even just have space to have the conversations. I mean, it doesn't even necessarily have to be training per se. I don't love the word training, but even just space guarded for having pedagogical conversations that would help them evolve as teachers.
Right.
And for adjuncts, that means paying them for that professional development, not just having it be available, but also paying them for it. And so these are some of the structural issues. Starbucks pays its staff members for required job training. The notion that pedagogical training wouldn't be required job training for teachers, and that most teachers, most faculty across the country wouldn't be compensated for that training, much less offered that training at all, to me is pretty appalling. So, I mean, that's the barrier that we're getting over in order to make any headway on this.
So we're veering away from the topic of grades altogether and just now moving into this issue that all faculty need time and space to learn about, to talk about students and pedagogy and all these things we do on a daily basis. We just need some time for that. And as you say, adjuncts are a special case because they're abused in so many ways. We did a workshop once and one of the faculty asked if we would pay for gas because they had to get there. And it's like, well, yeah, and we paid for gas. And then someone said, gee, this is the first time anyone's ever bought us a meal. Unbelievable. Anyway, everybody has stories. So, all right. So there's structural issues that we're not going to solve today. There are tens of thousands of faculty. How many people do you think nationwide are involved in this conversation?
I think tens of thousands. I mean, that first blog post that I wrote got read by 60,000 people.
Okay.
So, and I don't know. I haven't tracked the data since that to see. I mean, I don't don't quantify it. I don't quantify it all. I'm not ranking my blog posts against one another. But I do know at one point that I looked at that blog post, 60,000 people had read it. So it's clearly a topic that people are really interested in. And it's a topic I think people are really interested in because of I don't think all of the other things we're talking about are separate conversations. They're all connected to one another.
Mm-hmm.
Some degree, faculty feel overworked. And when they look at their job and they say, what do I care about? What matters to me? Grading is not the thing that matters to them, and yet is the thing that they're being compelled to do and compelled to spend a lot of time doing.
Right.
So I would say ultimately, every faculty member everywhere is interested in this issue. I've never spoken to a faculty member when I ask the question, how does it feel to be graded? How does it feel to grade? I have never, in 20 years of doing this, no one has ever told me, I love grading. Grading is the best part of my job. It's what I wake up to do. So I think it's really tens of thousands or everyone.
Yeah. Well, clearly, if you had 60,000, we're going to call it now hundreds of thousands, but we're still a long way from 1.x million. Okay. We need to come back to some practical questions because that's where I live. What can people do now to help their students? While this is stressful for faculty, it's also stressful for students. And that creates lots of issues for students and their ability to continue and persist. And that, of course, then disproportionately affects the minoritized and historically excluded students. So there's all sorts of reasons why we really need to address these issues. So can we talk for a few minutes just about how you implement assessment in your courses? And I'll try to not label it.
Yeah, and I guess I will say my centering the question on the whys and the sort of deeper issues that underlie this isn't to say that we don't need to talk about the hows at all. It's that at almost every point we need to check back in with ourselves. What is my pedagogy? What matters to me? What kind of relationship do I want to have with students? So ultimately, when we get to the point of talking about what can we do tomorrow and what can we do tomorrow, both individually in our individual classrooms, but also collectively with one another as co-teachers. Because I think the precarity of teaching demands that we work together with one another. I think that we always have to start back with that first foundational set of questions. Yeah. What is it that I'm trying to do? What kind of relationships am I trying to build? What do I want to get out of my teaching? What do I want my students to get out of their learning? To then think about how is my assessment impacting those things? What barriers is my current approach to assessment putting up towards, for example, building the kind of relationships that I want to build with the students? Right. If we think I want to build a relationship of trust, most of our standardized quantitative systems aren't really designed to support a relationship of trust. I want to create a space of collaboration between me and students. Again, most of our standardized quantitative approaches aren't designed to support collaborative relationship between students and teachers. They support hierarchical relationships.
Right.
And so ultimately it's about starting by asking that question and then looking to our own practice and wondering what things am I doing to get in my own way so that I'm not able to do the work that I want to do. So I'm not able to feel the joy that I want to feel. For example, if we look at our own teaching and we recognize, wow, I'm spending more of my time grading than I am spending just talking to students. The answer to that is relatively simple. Spend less time on grading, more time talking to students. And to me, it usually isn't that hard to implement something like that if we recognize, and so I need to practice an approach to assessment that has me spending less time doing it so that I have more time to do the most important work of talking to students. And then if I think about what do I advocate as being the most important thing that teachers can do tomorrow in order to begin to push on assessment, it is to engage students in a conversation about assessment. And where grades matter, which is almost everywhere, where grades are currency for students, which is almost everywhere, having a conversation with students where we ask them, what are grades to you? How do grades work? How do grades motivate you? How do grades demotivate you? Having that conversation with students alone, I think, fundamentally changes the relationship we have with them and also fundamentally changes how they engage and we engage with grades as a system and a structure.
So do you begin every class? I assume you do then begin every class with a discussion about grades.
I don't actually begin. I used to begin. I used to do it very early in the term.
Mm-hmm.
But what I found was that grades are scary to students. And
Mm-hmm.
I know why. A lot of students have trauma around grades.
Mm-hmm.
Grades also are currency for students. And I use that word really deliberately. They mean money. They mean future jobs. They mean future
Mm-hmm.
grad school acceptances. They mean admission to law school. They're currency. They also potentially mean currency really deliberately, as in I'll lose my scholarship or I'll lose my funding if I'm getting the Hope Scholarship in the state of Georgia.
Mm-hmm.
So recognizing that and recognizing that grades, I can't just say, oh, grades don't matter, because they do matter. And so what I've tended to do is take that conversation about grades and move it about five. Like if I'm teaching a 15-week class, I move it about 5 weeks in. Because then I've developed trust with students and a certain kind of rapport that allows us to have the conversation where they can believe by that point that I'm not going to pull a rug out from under them, because they've seen me for 5 weeks, 7 weeks,
Mm-hmm.
however long it is, not pull a rug out from under them. But come in the first day and say, hey, we're going to throw grades out. Students aren't in a place to really have that conversation on that day. Not all students.
You don't throw grades out. You give grades at the end of the semester. You don't grade during the semester, if I understand correctly. You provide assessment and feedback. So you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I actually would say that oftentimes grades and feedback are set up as oppositional to one another. And it's imagined that we would take grades away, grades issued by an instructor, and replace them by feedback issued by an instructor. I don't necessarily love that, because to me, ultimately, I'm interested in, can the students start to do some of this work themselves? And so to me, a lot of my work is about metacognitive. It's about building a space in the course where students can provide each other feedback and also do metacognitive work to do self-assessment. And so that doesn't mean I don't give feedback, or it doesn't mean I'm not engaged in the process of assessment, but I'm trying to extract myself from it as much as possible and build a community of feedback within the course where they're getting it as much from me as they're getting it from each other. And ideally, because there's a lot more students than there are me usually in most classes, they're getting more feedback from each other than they're getting from me. So yes, I'm definitely not removing grades. They still get a grade at the end of the term. Would I give them a grade if my institution didn't require me to? No. My institution requires me to issue a grade at the end of the term. So to me, it's about figuring out how to negotiate that structural impediment, is what I would see it as, myself and together with my students. They give themselves a grade. 90% of the time, 95% of the time, I give them the grade they give themselves.
So let's talk for a minute about students assessing each other, which I can imagine in a couple of not ways, but there's a cynical me which says, great, but students, they're not experts, so their feedback is not valuable or might not be valuable. So that's the sort of the cynical me, or it's got to be somewhat true at the beginning, right? Students have to learn how to provide assessment. And I guess the other good thing about it, the positive, is that giving assessment must also be a learning moment for the students, right? So they can learn from that assessment. So maybe you can comment a little bit about both ends of that spectrum.
Yeah, and I would say it's true of self-assessment also. I mean, people often say, but my students are struggling with self-assessment. And my thought is, good, a self-assessment is hard. It's something we do need to struggle to learn. I still find it difficult to do self-assessment, and I've been doing it for however many years. And so when students are first encountering self-assessment, they're not necessarily going to be good at it, especially if they've spent their whole educational career getting this extrinsic, kind of constant extrinsic evaluation and feedback. So much that in some ways, some of those muscles that they have to do metacognitive work have been shut down. And not necessarily, I'm not cynical about students, because I don't think they've been shut down altogether, but they've been shut down in the environment of school. They walk into a classroom and they see education paraphernalia, and all of a sudden their habit is to just shut that off, because they know they're going to get constant feedback from students. And by feedback, I mean both written feedback, but also constantly feedback in the form of grades. And so ultimately, it's about how do we build those skills in students? And in some ways, I would say rebuild those skills in students. My 6-year-old in kindergarten, I think, is better at self-assessment than I am.
Hmm.
And there's a reason. And the reason, in my view, is because I've been through, 25 years of formal education that have like trained me not to be able to do it anymore.
Right. Interesting. Okay, so you must provide some structure so that you can help your students learn to assess what's valuable assessment, what's valuable feedback. It's not just, oh yeah, great job, it looks great. It must be more structured. You must provide that instruction.
I would say provide that instruction, sure, but also give them space to practice at it.
Absolutely.
Because I don't use a rubric, for example, and say, here's the 6 things you can do to give people meaningful feedback. Because in some ways, what I need to do is create a culture in the classroom. I think more of the work for me is about creating a culture rather than giving students a script that they can parrot. And I don't think that's what you're suggesting that I do, but I do want to make that clarification because I think that's often the direction that we go when we're having students do peer review or having them give feedback. We imagine that they don't already know how to give feedback. Students know how to give feedback. They just don't necessarily know what the context of the classroom is and what that feedback is and why it would be valuable and how to do it. Put 2 people down together talking about a piece of writing or a new Dungeons and Dragons module that they're creating. They have a great conversation about what's working and what's not working. Suddenly you throw them into a peer review where they've been given rubrics for 15 years, and all of a sudden they're not able to do it in quite the same way. It's a little bit of a both and. Yes, support them, but also give them the space to use the skills they already have.
And do you think that, I've got to believe that their ability to provide valuable feedback varies as they move along the spectrum from novice to expert. My concern is that novices, how do you give constructive feedback if you're not an expert in the field and you yourself are struggling to learn the content? As opposed to a senior, hopefully, that has developed some expertise that has much more context in which to provide that feedback.
I'm going to turn this on its head a little bit.
Sure.
And I think you're definitely right, but I want us to back up just a touch and ask, what is it that the freshman or the novice can do that the senior or the expert can't do? And ultimately, if we think about, because people will often say, oh, I can do ungrading with my seniors, but I have a difficulty doing it with my freshmen. And what I have found to be true is that freshmen are at this perfect moment, freshmen in college. And this is true at other moments in our educational careers. But a freshman in college has, in some ways, had a lot of their life reset. They've often moved out of the home for the first time. And here we're talking about slightly more traditional students, although I don't know that I buy the idea that there are traditional students. Most students are different from other students, irregardless of what level they're at. But so they're at this kind of critical moment where they're coming to a new school, a new place. And to me, in some ways, they're primed for a reset. You take seniors, and seniors have been retrained in a very static approach to what academia or academic work looks like. I think there's strengths at both ends of the spectrum, and I think we have to recognize that and sort of utilize and lean into those strengths. So giving freshmen, for example, more leeway to just try and experiment, and at the same time, taking our seniors and pushing them out of their comfort zone by asking them to do things that don't look like the things that they've done constantly for the last 4 to 5 years.
Right. And I guess one important question there is what has their career looked like academically? Do you have a department that has fully embraced some principles of ungrading and has moved forward pedagogically? Or is your course the only course they've ever seen that works this way? And if it's your course is the only course they've ever seen that works this way, well then of course, and I guess that must be what is mostly true for people, is that people mostly must be experiencing they're the unusual one in a sea of tradition.
I think absolutely. And it's one of the reasons why generally when people are saying, oh, I find this much easier to do with my seniors, I think I find it much easier to do with the freshmen that I work with, in part because by the time that students get to be seniors, they've been extraordinarily well trained by a very conventional system.
Right. So it's hard for them to break that pattern. Okay. So let's talk about some hows questions. So you mentioned freshmen. What are things that people are doing in ungrading? What are some ideas about how people could take first steps down this path? And what are the steps they could take in, for example, a modest size class of 20 or 30 versus a larger class of 200 or 400? What are things that different people could do?
I think to some degree we can go back a little bit to that concept of summative versus formative. I think one of the things we can do when we're looking at a freshman seminar or a freshman biology course, a 101 course,
Mm-hmm.
is ask ourselves whether at that point in a student's educational career we need any summative information at all. Is it possible to just focus the learning almost entirely and exclusively on formative? So, in other words, at what point do we need summative information? To me, to some degree, like if I think about someone going out into the workforce, probably we need some summative information by the end of their college career, but we probably don't need it first semester of their freshman year, and maybe the students don't need it either. So if we lean into formative at that point, what would that look like? What would that look like in a big lecture class with 250 students? It might look like having students don't have to take any tests individually. They take every test collaboratively. And if we acknowledge that what we really care about is formative assessment, essentially assessing for learning rather than assessing the learning, then collaborative test taking is much more beneficial to students. It teaches students how to take tests. It teaches students what they know, what they don't know. It allows students who are at a similar level to talk to one another, get feedback in the sense of just feedback that happens automatically when you're sitting doing something next to someone who's also doing the same thing. As opposed to the reason we isolate students and say you have to take this test by yourself in this controlled environment is because we're trying to rank them against one another and get some sort of summative information that we imagine would be useful. What we've seen in most fields is that what that tends to do is it tends to eliminate people from the field. Essentially, the people who the test is not designed for get weeded out. I hate that concept. But a lot of institutions are doing it even though they insist that they're not doing it or that it's not a value. They're doing it necessarily because the assessments are designed in a way that support the learning of one particular population of students at the expense of other populations. So if we step back and say there's nothing at 101 that should weed anyone out, and we accept that different people learn in different ways at different times, all of a sudden we can support all the students in those classes better. And then if we're not having to do summative assessment, well, hey, that saves us the time of doing summative assessment that we can then spend on building relationships, building community, and designing more thoughtful formative assessments.
And so in a course like that, would you support just a pass-fail sort of situation?
I hate to walk back all of the suggestions that you make, but the issue with pass-fail is that when we're talking about grades, we need to think about what the stakes are. And in some ways, people during the start of the pandemic tried to do compassionate grading. And most of the compassionate grading was some version of pass-fail. The stakes in pass-fail go up because you either pass or you fail. The F becomes even more scary in a pass-fail situation. So I don't think the answer is pass-fail. I think the answer is pass-pass. Or the answer is, which is what I advocated at the start of the pandemic, that the answer is pass, no record, which essentially means that the person passes or there is no record of what they did.
Okay.
They just get to do it again.
Yeah, it just disappears.
Yeah, why would it? What is useful to us in knowing that a student got an F as a freshman? The only thing that supports is the degree of bias that we see later down the road, where there ends up being a halo effect. Students who do well continue to do well, and that's because of implicit bias in the individual teachers and implicit bias that's built into the system.
Right. I like that a lot. It sort of allows you to handle small classes, large classes. I mean, would you do anything different in small classes? If you can do that in a large class, small classes, you have more flexibility and more opportunities to interact with students on a daily basis.
I think what's interesting is that people often say that something like ungrading becomes much harder with large classes. I struggle with that hypothesis. And the reason I struggle with it is because when I started ungrading, I was teaching 9 classes as a road warrior adjunct at 4 different institutions. I had 1,000 students in a single term at one point. And for me, a lot of the things I was doing was actually designed for a much larger group of students. I was designing my approaches to be something that could scale, that could allow me to build relationships with a large group of students. So ultimately, when we think about self-assessment and teaching students how to self-assess and modeling self-assessment, and you think about something like peer assessment, those things scale extraordinarily well. Not taking agency away from students scales really well, because then you've got a lot of people who you haven't stripped of agency, and a lot of people willing to engage and do work to support their own learning, which then ultimately means that a lower amount of that is falling upon the shoulders of the teacher. People assume also, because they imagine learning and spaces of education are transactional, which is what Paulo Freire pushes back against in his work, this sort of banking transactional model of education, which so many of our systems have just baked in to the system. They imagine that education is a one-to-one transaction. Students give me work, I give them a grade. Well, all of a sudden, if you switch that out and think of it as a relationship between a whole bunch of people that are in community with one another, and that community might be being structured by the teacher, I don't actually accept work from my students at all. Students don't turn work into me. They turn work into each other. I become one audience for that work. They then all of a sudden have 100 different readers, or 25 or 75 or 1,000 different readers, potential readers for their work. And ultimately then their learning is being supported by all of those people. It's impossible to create those relationships of community in a space that feels competitive.
Right. So the environment you're describing sounds to me like a highly structured environment. You have to spend a lot of time really structuring and thinking about what your course looks like, as you've said. I mean, you really have to be very thoughtful and intentional about the structure. But that once you've designed this structure, then you now have engaged students in a new and novel way in your courses for them to not only think about their own learning, but to learn from others' learning.
Yeah, and it's part of what you're pointing to is that oftentimes people see flexibility as somehow at odds with structure. And most of my pedagogy is all about building flexibility, recognizing that different students learn in different ways at different times, providing the necessary flexibility to support all the different kinds of learning that's happening in the course. But I don't think flexibility is at odds with structure. Structure supports flexibility. It's the same thing with relationships. Community depend upon people setting boundaries. We set boundaries. That's what allows us to feel safe in community. So it's not that there are no boundaries. It's not that there's no structure. It's that instead, just the opposite. Having good boundaries, having structure in your course allows for the kind of relationships that form and the kind of flexibility that students find their way in. Ideally, I would create a course where students wouldn't have to ask for accommodations because the course already had that flexibility built into it. Ideally, I would design a course where students didn't need feedback from me because the community of the course was supporting their work in a way that made my feedback not unnecessary, but made my feedback not primary. I give my students a lot of feedback. I ultimately give them feedback that they ask for. One of the things I have them do in self-assessments and self-reflections is tell me what they want feedback on. Tell me how I can better support them. And that's where I step in. And sometimes I also step in just as a reader of their work. I've come upon their work and here's what I notice. Here's what I'm seeing. But for the most part, what I want to do is try and have myself be increasingly less necessary as the course goes along and increasingly less necessary as the arc of their education goes along.
So when you have these conversations with students a third of the way through your course, and when you say, okay, let's talk about grades finally, and they've spent 5 weeks exposed to something they've never seen before, they are commenting to each other, they're engaging with each other about their learning in ways they've never done before in a course, and then they come in one day and you say, okay, today we're talking about assessment and grading and how this is going to go. What's that like? What's that conversation look like?
Usually I have a context for it. So to me, it doesn't come out of nowhere. It's not part of a lesson plan. It's part of an ongoing conversation I'm having with students. So I don't necessarily know what day it's going to happen in. Instead, I read the room. I feel the hum in the room. I recognize we're at a point where I think we can start to put words to some of what's going on in the course.
Okay.
So when I come in that day, usually I start the conversation by just saying, hey, I was reading this piece XYZ, or I noticed the other day this thing, or I saw someone give feedback to someone else that said this. And so it rises out of the conversations we're already having. So usually it doesn't feel like a diversion. Usually it feels completely part of the other work that we're doing. And the students have usually been thinking about it up to that point to a certain degree, but a bunch of their anxiety around it has already worn off. I constantly tell my students, come to me if you're feeling anxious. Don't let yourself sit in any anxiety about this. Recognize that we're doing things a little bit different here. Here's where you can reach me. Here's how you can reach me, and create moments for that. And so ideally, by the time we have this conversation, students have already settled into it and felt like they've tried it and felt like they've worked through it, and they feel like they can trust each other as well as trust me. Mm-hmm. And what's cool is they end up talking about their own learning and their educational experiences. I end up hearing all manner of things about their other classes, about what they did in high school. And I let the conversation go where the conversation needs to go. And what I find more often than not is students have trauma around their own education, and that this becomes a space of not necessarily sharing all the details of that trauma, because I don't think that's what's necessary. Although I don't preclude them from sharing that. I also don't want to make our classroom a space where there's so many places in education where students get rewarded in certain ways for talking about their trauma. If we take, for example, the college entrance essay, the college entrance essay rewards students for sharing things about themselves that students shouldn't feel compelled to share in order to get into college. And I think there's other moments where that happens too. So I try really hard to make sure that I'm not part of that kind of economy, and I will call it an economy, a trauma economy. But instead, students talk about their educational experience and what they're finding different in the course that we're in. And invariably, they also start to make suggestions, because they realize pretty early on that every course I design in collaboration with the course that I'm teaching. So they recognize, oh, he's teaching another class, and he actually is listening to us and thinking about what he's going to be creating next term based on the conversation we're having right here. So they usually feel totally able, although it's still difficult, I think, for anyone, because the one thing is it's not like there's a level playing field. There still is a hierarchy in the classroom. It's pretty impossible to dismantle that, in part because the structure of the institution is reinforcing it at every turn. But there's a sense in which they can use that space to kind of process what's happening in their own education. And that's really my goal. Paulo Freire talks about wanting students to be readers of their world. And to some degree, when I think about like what is the goal of ungrading, the goal of ungrading is to have students be readers of their own education, able to make changes and become full agents in that education, and able to process it and make sense of it.
Let me then go back to the first week or two of your course, where students are in an environment. I mean, I'm sure you provide them with a syllabus with all sorts of information that must talk about how they're going to be assessed through the course. So then how do students adapt? You put them in a new environment. They're not getting feedback in the traditional way. And how quickly do they get comfortable with that?
I would say most students are very quickly comfortable with that. Part of the reason is because from the first day, we're talking about the course as a thing, and I nod to their own learning, and I talk about what I'm doing and why. Like that sort of meta level conversation is just part and parcel with my pedagogical style, that I'm always talking to them as one human being talking to another. And I'm always sort of laying my own process bare to them to some extent, so that they can see inside of what I'm doing, as opposed to just saying the course is something that happens to you. It's something I create and then happens to you. Or assessment is something that I design and then happens to you. Instead, it's something that we're doing together, and just using that language throughout. And I'll say the syllabus, sure, my syllabus has a statement about assessment and grades. And
Sure.
partly that's there because a lot of students read syllabi in order to find out what they're getting into. And so for those students, I want that to be there so that it's very clear and very transparent and straightforward. But to some degree, I don't think the syllabus is the first thing students should be reading when they enter a course. I think the first thing they should be doing is building relationships with the other people in the course. Mm-hmm. And that means me, and that means all of the other students. Mm-hmm. I wish that we weren't deciding what courses we were taking based on the syllabus. I recognize that a lot of students feel they have to do that because they've had the rug pulled out from under them. So they're poring over syllabi to some extent to make sure there aren't traps in it. What I'd rather is that we find ourselves in communities and decide whether those are communities that we feel safe in and that we feel like will support our learning. So I would rather them come and talk to each other and talk to me and make decisions about the course based on those conversations. And then the syllabus then just becomes a guiding document that we're using throughout the term.
Sure. How long have you been at your current institution?
I've been at University of Denver for 2 years.
Okay. So University of Denver, the buzz is just building about you, right? Because students talk to each other, right? And there's so much knowledge that's passed around that way. You will be getting students who come into your classes, and maybe you're getting them already, that already expect a difference because they've heard, because they know what it's going to be like because other students have told them. That must be, It's probably already happening.
And I think that's a good thing. I mean, I think that I want students to self-select into their learning spaces. And another thing that I often say is that I don't want to proselytize about pedagogy. I don't want ungrading to become a zeitgeist that everyone just signs on to as though it's some kind of petition that we're all going to agree to together, that we're all going to do exactly the same thing tomorrow. In part because I say that thing about different students learn in different ways at different times. Different teachers support different students in different ways at different times. So ultimately, I want different teachers to work differently. Ideally, education wouldn't be, prefab. It would be something where students are actually having real relationships in real circumstances. This notion that we get into the real world after college. College already is the real world, and it should resemble the real world where different people work in different ways.
Yeah, many of us would like to see a change in the environment in all classes such that the focus becomes on learning and less on grades. So we de-emphasize grades so they demotivate students less. If we just talk about motivational issues, right, we need to change the way we think about and handle and discuss and do grading with students so that their interest and spark can stay and not be crushed by the system. So there's lots of important reasons to really think about this and really to have people implement various forms, whatever those forms are, of more student-centered learning and focusing on those issues.
Yeah, I think that's part of the reason why I talk about ungrading as a conversation. And then ultimately it's a systemic critique of grades. And it isn't necessarily advocating that there's one thing we should replace grades with. It's to point to grades and say, this is a fundamentally inequitable system. Grades do harm to students. Grades also do harm to teachers. Grades do an inordinate amount of harm to marginalized students and precarious teachers. Therefore, grades should be eradicated. What we replace them with is a lot of different things that work in different ways. But ultimately, those things shouldn't be another version of grades.
I mean, that was great. Okay, let's move on to a few final questions. Concerning student success, if you had a magic wand and you could wave it and have every faculty member do one thing, what would that one thing be?
Interesting. I want to actually say two things. And one is I want to start by saying I want institutions and administrators to wave a wand first to properly support and prepare teachers for the work of teaching.
Okay.
Once we do that, once we knock down the giant barrier that most teachers have to doing their work, I want teachers to decide what their pedagogy is and decide what kinds of relationships they want to create with each other and students, and then teach in ways that support their own philosophies. And ultimately, that means grades are not a really great thing to be doing. So I would love it if they realized that.
Okay. So two things. One, administrators first provide faculty with training so that everybody can has space to talk about these issues.
And support, which is, I think, a slightly different thing. It is, training might be a kind of support, but support means ongoing support for the continuing development of those teachers.
Okay. And then for teachers to then think a lot about those issues and teach in ways that support your values. Thank you. That's great. You've made national and international impacts on these issues of grading, assessment, and student success. Can you talk about why this particular issue has become so important to you? Was there a transformational moment that drove you to this issue?
I think absolutely. I mean, for someone who's never put a grade on a piece of student work, why are grades and assessment so central to my research and the work that I do and the writing that I do?
Mm-hmm.
What I noticed over 20 years of doing faculty development is that grades were the elephant in the room of every conversation underway in education. And so ultimately for me, it was to recognize that almost every conversation that we were having, I was listening to teachers say, I would love to do X, but I can't because of, and usually it had something to do with grades, or some version of, but how would we assess that? How would we grade that? Or talking about something like learning outcomes and having people say, oh, but I don't know that we can measure the success of that. As though we can measure the success of something like have an epiphany, which seems like a really great learning outcome. Some of the best learning outcomes are things we can't actually measure.
Right.
And so I've said that grades are a thorn in the side of critical pedagogy. Grades are an elephant in the room of every conversation underway in education. And so ultimately, I think that they're the biggest hurdle that we have to overcome to do the work that I think is valuable and to build the kinds of communities we want to build in education. So we can't do any of the stuff that I think really matters unless we start by breaking apart the system that is dictating so much of what we do in education, which is grades.
Okay, I'm going to push a little here. So is there something that happened to you personally that made this so important?
Oh, okay.
Why is this so central to you? Why did you could have done, you could just write about zombies. Come on, let's talk, we could be talking about The Last of Us. We could be talking about, right? There's lots of things we could talk about. And you've lots of things you've written about.
Yeah.
You never had to go down this road. You didn't have to. It was a choice.
Yep. Yeah, and I'll answer, and I'll give two examples, and they will be increasingly personal.
Okay.
The first, less personal, because I don't know, talking about the grades that I've received in my life doesn't seem like the most personal thing. It is for some people. For me, not necessarily as much. There's actually a couple pieces to this story. I remember when I was in middle school, my first year of middle school, 6th grade. Suddenly I had gone from elementary school getting extraordinarily good grades to my first half of 6th grade. I was getting almost straight D's and F's. And ultimately it was my ornery self saying, but I don't want to do it the way that they're making me do it. And so my dad and my brother were having a conversation with me about my grades, and they never really demonized me about them. I mean, they understood what I was saying when I said, well, that's why. They said, but the thing is, we think you can do it and we think it wouldn't be that difficult for you, but we're going to give you a challenge. So they bet me that I couldn't get straight A's. Okay. And so I got straight A's. And the school called me in and said, how do you go from getting D's and F's to suddenly getting A's? And I said, well, I decided to. I decided to get, because ultimately some of these systems, if you decide and figure out how to work the system, they're pretty transparent. And then I remember in graduate school, the worst grade that I ever got, and it's the one that causes me the most ire to this day. And it was from a teacher I had had 4 or 5 times. So a teacher that I thought I had a deep, trusting relationship with that went both ways. And the teacher gave me an A-. And that A-, sticks with me to this day because it was so inscrutable to me that it felt somehow personal. And then that same teacher in a subsequent course gave me an A for the course, but then changed my grade to an A minus later. Breaking the rules of the institution that you're not supposed to change grades arbitrarily, which the teacher did. And interestingly, that was the paper and it was the course that I worked the hardest for in my life, but got these weird inscrutable grades. And so that caused me a good amount of grief. And now I'm going to give you the much more personal answer to your question, which is to say that I personally have PTSD, not around grades. And PTSD is something that I live with on a daily basis. It's something I lived with and have been relatively open about in my career, talking about things like accessibility and neurodivergence and what it is to navigate educational systems as a person who's disabled. But the number of conversations that I've had with students around issues like grades, issues like student shaming, and the degree to which grades are often used as a way of shaming students, the number of conversations I've had with students and just seeing how deeply they're affected and traumatized brings out the mother bear in me. Honestly, It brings out the part of me that recognizes how deeply harmful systems of grades are to students and how those systems also support other kinds of abuse and trauma that students are subjected to.
Thank you for sharing that. I appreciate that.
We don't do our work for no reason. We don't come upon our work accidentally. Our work is embedded in who we are. The other reason I think I'm doing this work over the last 6 years, really, more than I did it prior to that, even though I was doing it behind the scenes, I wasn't writing as publicly about this topic, is because of my daughter. My daughter was born, and I saw from the moment that she was born, I saw her being graded. The way they track your development right from the first get-go, using that percentile score and a little chart. And she was 95th percentile for height and weight, and the way they talk about development. And then here she started kindergarten and started getting report cards. She was already getting some version of that previous to that, and starting to watch how early this starts with her and recognizing how much harm it does.
Yeah. All right, one last question. How has this lens of assessment and student success impacted you outside the academy? When you're living your life, when you're at the park with your daughter, when you're out to dinner with your husband, when you're living your life, I don't want to hear about students. I don't want to hear about other faculty. I don't want to hear, how has this lens impacted how you live your life day to day?
I think that it requires a certain amount of compassion for everybody. Because if I've got 50 students, I'm talking about students, but when I have a group of 50 students, my pedagogy requires that I show empathy, show compassion, provide flexibility, build accessibility into my course for every single one of those 50 people. And it's not like my students are somehow magical human beings and are necessarily good at all moments in their lives. It's that my pedagogy is to presume that they want to be there and to presume that supporting their learning is my role. And then if you take that out into the world, then I have to also do the same thing. I have to presume that every single human I encounter is worthy of compassion, is worthy of empathy, has experienced trauma in their life, is potentially neurodivergent or disabled, and maybe not able to speak about it openly. And so how do I engage with people as though different people work in different ways at different times? And I'll say that I don't know that I'm always as good at it outside of the classroom as I am inside of the classroom. And it's partly because of the context is different, and the way that we've established boundaries. It hasn't made me a universally good person, but it forces me to ask questions about what we're all doing and why we're doing it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, Jesse, I want to thank you. I want to thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today. I've really enjoyed our conversation. I'm not sure this was what I expected, but I've really enjoyed it. It's been great.
Thanks so much. I'm glad we went off in some seeming tangents and circled back around.
Yeah, it's been great. For more information about Dr. Jesse Stommel, his research, and his writings, please go to our website, teachingforstudentsuccess.org. Thank you for spending time with us today. Please share our podcast and website with your friends, colleagues, and administrators. We love hearing from our listeners. Please contact us through our website. If an episode has impacted your teaching, please send us a note and tell us your story. Teaching for Student Success is a production of Teaching for Student Success Media. Let's end this podcast, as I always do, with some music of Julius H. Some of Julius's music can be found on Pixabay.